So the first question is a very open question. And the question is, how do you see the sub-Saharan Africa evolving from the pandemic, and how do you see the economic outlook going forward?
Yeah, so maybe just to start where we were last year, it's notable that growth in sub-Saharan Africa declined less than in most other regions globally, partly because there was less pandemic impact. There were also somewhat less containment measures. And of course, that helped economies to sustain a degree of economic activity. Now, this year, we are seeing the recovery in the region to be somewhat weaker than in most other regions. And that reflects essentially that there is less of a base effect from last year. But it also reflects the fact that this region has probably less capacity for fiscal stimulus and has implemented less fiscal stimulus and less monetary stimulus than really most of the other regions. Clearly, in the rest of the world, the stimulus is something that is very, very important in driving the recoveries. And in many other countries, we are seeing this kind of rebound of growth to levels well above what is trend growth, what is potential growth. We are not seeing that in sub-Saharan Africa. We are expecting for sub-Saharan Africa in 2021 a growth level broadly around the potential, the long-term trend growth level, and then essentially more or less staying at that level in subsequent years.
How important for this recovery is, on the one hand, the vaccine issue, and on the other hand, the SDRs that were issued by the IMF a few weeks ago?
Clearly, into our forecast, there is what is not factored in is a new pandemic wave that really badly disrupts the economic activity. One thing that we've noted in the region, but I think also across the globe, is that with every new wave of pandemic, there is a degree of improved adaptation of economic performance, both because policymakers are better able to target the containment measures, and because generally economic actors are more have become accustomed to operating in the context of a pandemic, and so we certainly expect that there will be more pandemic waves in the region, but we assume that these will not be waves that fundamentally badly disrupt economic activity. For example, to the extent that you would have to close mines and factories and so on. That is just built into our assumptions. Clearly, it's the progress of vaccination is very slow, and that just means that normal waves of new waves of infections should be incorporated. The importance of the special drawing rights of the issuance of the IMF, it's certainly providing additional liquidity. It's certainly helping governments spend money on rolling out the vaccines, on additional healthcare expenditure, and it's kind of reducing the pressures. They are most important that are really struggling because of financial pressures. Zambia, obviously, which is already in default, is in fact globally the one country that is getting most from the IMF SDR allocation in terms of relative to GDP. And certainly it's true that this is also a country that is in very severe financial difficulties, and so will be benefiting from that a lot. There are a number of countries in Africa in a somewhat similar situation, but more broadly, the impact is a bit more limited. The overall impact of overall IMF support this year relative to GDP and median for the countries that we cover in the region is around 1.4% of GDP, which is a significant sum, but it's for example, it's far from covering budget deficits. It's far from covering gross finance needs. It's certainly helping in covering these fiscal pressures.
Yeah, and you mentioned in Friday's webinar that it wasn't much different from the 1.1% that it was offered during the financial crisis. So one of the other things that you said last Friday was that the number of downgrades this year compared to the last year was far less than in 2020, which is of course normal. But I wanted to ask you, and this is like my final question, how do you see the ratings of the country going forward? I mean, I'm not asking you to say if Angola will go up a notch or down a notch, but in general, I'm assuming that you see blue skies ahead, but how blue are the skies, so to speak?
Yeah, so I think there are still significant challenges for a number of sub-Saharan African countries, but I think what we are now seeing is a little bit more differentiation. Last year there was just one big shock that was hitting everyone, not all to the same degree, but there was one big shock that was negative, and so the direction could only be negative. Now we are seeing countries where some in some cases the shock actually might have been less than previously anticipated, where growth performed stronger than had been feared. But on the other hand, there are also still countries that are really still absorbing the shock, the surge in debt levels, and so those are kind of the countries that we would be observing most closely now. That where it's kind of important to see to what extent they are able to deal with the financing pressures that result from the crisis.
So is there anything else that you'd like to add? I mean, I see you are optimistic, but cautiously optimistic about the near future.
I'm not sure whether one would say optimistic. I think if we wanted to put an outlook on the region, there are still more negative outlooks than positive ones, so the direction is still with a degree of downside risks for the level of the ratings, but it's now no longer that there is only one direction. Now it's becoming a bit more normal that there is an upside. I mean, very importantly, we have had two positive rating upgrades, in fact, Gabon and Côte d'Ivoire, and certainly not to be excluded that there might be more. We have Benin on positive outlook, for example.